Today we'll be hearing from Eirik Nyhus, our Director for Environment, and Tore Longva, our Director for Decarbonization. Now, before we get started, let's have a quick look at the agenda today. So we'll be looking at the greenhouse gas strategy, other GHG matters. We'll have a quick look at the ballast water management and biofouling and ship recycling. And then finally, we'll have our Q&A session. So without any further ado or delay from me, let's get on with our first presentation. And Eirik, I hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Simon, for that introduction and for the kind words. Thank you to our audience. We are a lot of people today, so this has been a hotly anticipated meeting. We will talk you through this. Me and Tore, we've kind of split the sessions between ourselves, and we'll both be here for the Q&A, of course. So without further ado, let's just move into the first slide here. And I just wanted to put up a picture of the plenary hall at MEPC, at IMO. This is from MEPC 80, as Simon said, hotly anticipated meeting. We've never been that many people in that meeting room, I believe. We are packing in 750 maximum. There were roughly 1,000 attendees in the building, another 500 attending online. So there was a lot of attention on this, should also mention that we had, of course, a technical session the week before. So for some of us, this was 2 weeks in London actually working on greenhouse gas matters. And we were not alone. We also had our demonstrators with us. This seems to be the new normal when it comes to IMO meetings. We always have a group of, I'd say, friendly people standing outside and trying to encourage us to do the right thing. So that was kind of the setup to this week's meeting. What I want to do now is essentially, of course, jump straight into the highlight, the greenhouse gas strategy. We did lots of other things during that week. We'll be talking about those as well, but this was the linchpin of the session and our focus, of course. So what do we have? This slide encapsulates the present strategy. I should hasten to add, this was universally agreed. There were no exemptions. There were no reservations at the end of the week. There was, I would say, universal acclamation, even though nobody got exactly what they wanted. It was quite complex. There were multiple red lines all over the place, and it really went down to the wire before we managed to get an agreement on what the long-term revised greenhouse gas strategy should be. Now, what is it? As a quick recap, you may recall that in 2018, the IMO adopted the initial greenhouse gas strategy 5 years ago. Without going into too many details on that, I would just emphasize that the ultimate decarbonization goal of that strategy was, of course, to decarbonize shipping sometime within this century. Fairly vague wording, it could be interpreted in many ways, but with the penultimate decarbonization target being 2050, where we should see a 50% reduction compared with 2008 levels. That has now been shifted downwards to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. There is some wording on the in order of by or around, i.e. close to. That is not really critical in this sense. As far as shipping is concerned, 2050 is the target where we've now been instructed. That's when we should attain net zero greenhouse gas emissions. I also want to mention that we're not just talking about tank to wake here, we're talking about well to wake emissions. And for those who are questioning what exactly that means, Tore will be talking more about this a little bit later in the presentation. So we have an ultimate target, 2050, net zero greenhouse gas emissions. How do we get there? Well, there are now defined milestones, checkpoints, if you will. Interim goals would be another way of phrasing it. And these are packaged around essentially 2030 and 2040 as markers. We do have the phrase still living with us, peak as soon as possible, because it is important that we actually start to decline emissions significantly and to start doing it quickly. But we now have markers for 2030. We can do those first. First and foremost, there is a reduction target of 20% compared to 2008 levels. We are on our way towards that target when we look at the study, at the baselines and what we have achieved so far, but there is still some ways to go, and it will require efforts by shipping to get there for sure. We have also retained an intensity target for 2030. That will be the 40% reduction in carbon intensity, which has been the driver, if you will, behind the CII. That remains unchanged. That is still a 40% intensity reduction target. Then we have a new additional target also for 2030, that when it comes to fuel, and rather what's called uptake of zero or near zero greenhouse gas technologies, fuels and or energy sources, that should have a 5% share when we get to 2030. Seeing that that's just 6.5 years down the road, that's also a pretty ambitious target, and it will be interesting to see how we now mobilize our resources to get there. Secondly, there is a checkpoint, interim target, call it what you will, for 2040, where we're looking at a 70% reduction in absolute greenhouse gas net zero emissions. Quite ambitious, quite the tightening compared with what we had in the initial strategy. And speaking personally, I was optimistic going into this session, but we actually got a strategy that I would say is a bit more, even more ambitious than I thought we would get. And this speaks to the political consensus at the IMO and how this has evolved over the last 5-10 years. It's quite clear that the IMO is committed to decarbonization here. Now, we also have agreement in principle on new greenhouse gas measures, because of course a strategy is a policy document. It does not set legally binding targets. The legally binding mechanisms is what we will get when we get the regulations in place. And there is now agreement on the kind of regulations that we will be getting. We don't have all the details yet. There is still work to be done. But we now know that the IMO has agreed to a greenhouse gas intensity fuel standard. And for those of you who are familiar with what the EU has been doing, it's kind of conceptually similar to the Fuel EU Maritime regulation, though the details will differ, of course. But it really is about what you burn and not about how much you burn. It's about the greenhouse gas footprint per unit of fuel. And there will be an agreement where we will be defining the reduction trajectory for this greenhouse gas intensity, and that of course is expected to align with what we have decided in the strategy. The intensity should ensure that shipping actually attains its reduction goals when it comes to the absolute emissions. Now, we have a couple of proposals on the table. We have one from the EU and we have one from China that we'll put forward to this meeting. They differ somewhat, but conceptually they have quite a lot in common, and it's expected from our end at least that these would probably form the design basis for what the final regulation is going to look like. There's also agreement on an economic element, essentially a price on greenhouse gas emissions. This one is a bit more vague. We do not have agreement on what that mechanism should look like. Everybody is in agreement that emissions should cost. There is a possibility of this being linked directly to the greenhouse gas intensity fuel standard, for instance, but there is more work needed to hammer out the details on how that one is going to work. And of course, this is quite a complex piece of work, because at the end of the day, we're potentially talking about a significant amount of money being generated by such a mechanism, which is always, shall we say, it always creates interesting discussions on how money should be collected, managed, and dispersed. But it is, at least as seen from our perspective, an element that is absolutely necessary to ensure that we have global equity taken care of when it comes to how the impact of this regulation is going to play out. There is an ambitious timeline here. We are looking at adoption already in 2025, and for practical purposes, that means that when we get to MEPC 81, that will be in April next year, we actually need at that session to try to hammer out a base document for these two elements that we can agree on, so that we can develop the regulatory text, develop the legal language, develop the necessary MARPOL amendments, etc., etc., so that this, with adoption in 2025, can enter into force in 2027. And for those who are impatient, this sounds like a long time, 4 years until you get entry into force, but it should be said that the IMO has a process whereby it needs to work to bring everybody on board and to ensure that regulations are robust. So this is actually quite fast-paced, to be honest, and the work we need to do to get this done, to have a good platform for refinement in a year's time, we have a lot of work to do. Now, what does this actually mean implication-wise? And if we think of the business implications of this strategy, first and foremost, and maybe most importantly, a lot of uncertainty has actually been taken away now. We have our marching orders, we have a course and speed for maritime decarbonization, and we actually need now to up our game in the industry, broadly speaking, in the fuel industry, to actually get this show on the road. We have added additional regulations in the pipeline, as I talked about. Now, these regulations will, of course, also overlap with what, for instance, the EU is doing through the Fuel EU Maritime, through the ETS, etc., etc. So the regulatory complexity and the overlap will increase. It will take a while before we get to a point where we can start discussing if that can be sorted somehow, but it also implies that compliance will actually become tougher. There will be stricter requirements, there will be more requirements, and the sheer administration of compliance will become harder and more challenging for shipping companies. But we know two things here. We know that first and foremost, when it comes to what you need to think about doing, energy efficiency improvements will remain important, because despite the fact that some regulations will be, as I said, about what you burn and not about how much you burn, energy efficiency improvements will always reduce the cost. It will always make compliance easier with other regulations as well. So that's tick one. Also, and this is a no-brainer in many ways, zero and near zero fuels are essential. We now have a 5% target for 2030. It's quite ambitious. We have targets also coming out of the EU, but the fuel supply industry has received a very clear message here that they need to start investing in making these fuels available for shipping. And now they actually do have a much greater certainty that there will be an actual demand. And finally, when it comes to the shipping companies themselves, again, you need to know and understand your own emissions data. This will be business critical. It will also be critical from a compliance point of view. You need to make sure that you know where you are in order to get your contracts right and in order to ensure that you're on the track to legal compliance. So with that, I will hand over to Tore, and I'll be back for the Q&A once we get there. Over to Tore.
Thanks, Eirik. So Eirik has now taken us through the greenhouse gas strategy and the political decisions that have been made through that document. In parallel, there has been a lot of other things happening on the technical side, both on greenhouse gas, but also on energy efficiency and other matters that I will take you through now. So Eirik talked a lot about zero and near zero fuels, net zero greenhouse gas emissions, life cycle perspective. All of this is operationalized through what's called the fuel life cycle guidelines that has been adopted now at the IMO. So this actually sets out the method for how to calculate the well-to-wake emissions from fuels, expressed in gram CO2 equivalents per megajoule. So CO2 equivalents includes CO2, includes methane, and it includes N2O or laughing gas, which are the three main greenhouse gases, and it expressed per megajoule of fuel energy. It also sets out sustainability topics or aspects, which we expect will be expressed further in sustainability criteria. This applies in particular to biofuels, how to handle land use problems, but they could also apply to e-fuels, other types of fuels, covering other aspects than the actual greenhouse gas emissions that you want to avoid when producing these fuels. The life cycle guidelines also sets up a fuel life cycle label, which will be the information bearer. How can you convey all this information in conjunction with the bunker delivery note? So it's more like a form or a template for how to provide that information. And it also provides preliminary default emission factors for about 100 different fuel pathways, meaning a handful of fuel types and quite a lot of variant fuel pathways. Now, it should be noted that there are no provisions for application in this guideline. They are just a technical outline on how, or methods for how to calculate and evaluate different fuels. And in order to be applied, they need to be included in different guidelines for the specific regulations. So we expect for sure that this will be part of the greenhouse gas fuel standard that was mentioned by Eirik. But it could also be part of, for example, the CII in the future. I'll come back a little bit to that afterwards. So this is very much a preliminary guideline. It needs to be developed further, but it was also quite a pressure to make this adopted right now to kind of set the first stage for these guidelines. So in the coming years, we will look at more default emission factors, developing sustainability criteria, specifying how to certify this fuel, in particular on the well-to-tank side, and also handling of onboard carbon capture, which I will come back to a little bit later. What's been a lot of focus the last year, we have received a lot of questions about how can the use of biofuels be handled under the current data collection and the carbon intensity indicator regulations. So in waiting for the LCI guidelines, it was very hard to provide a uniform application of these fuels. As you may know, the data collection and CII is normally a tank-to-wake CO2 emission reporting system. And the biofuels, they contain carbon, they do emit CO2, but in a well-to-wake perspective, they are considered close to a carbon neutral fuel. But how to handle that under the DCS and CIS was a big question. So at this session, we managed to have a circular on a uniform application of biofuels. And the result was that biofuels can use the CO2 conversion factor equal to the well-to-wake greenhouse gas emissions under a certain set of criteria. I'll repeat that because it's a little bit counterintuitive, but meaning that for fossil fuels, you use the actual CO2 emissions, the CO2 conversion factors of the fuel, but for biofuels, you use the well-to-wake greenhouse gas emission factor. And the criteria is that they have to be certified by an international certification scheme, for example, by the ICAO, needs to meet that scheme's sustainability criteria, and it needs to provide a well-to-wake greenhouse gas emissions at least 65% lower than a fossil MGO, meaning that the biofuel needs to be sustainable and needs to have a significant greenhouse gas emission reduction criteria before it can have a benefit through the data collection and CI regulations. This is a temporary fix. It doesn't really apply the LCI guidelines that I mentioned earlier, but we expect that during the review of the CII that this will be more aligned with the LCA guideline. However, due to the already use of these biofuels, there was a need for this circular. So moving over to the carbon intensity indicator, this is part of the shorter measures that IMO put in place for the achieving the 2030 targets over 40% carbon intensity reduction. So the CII and also the EEXI are scheduled for a review by the end of 2025. And at this stage, the IMO agreed on a timeline. So until MEPC 82 in fall 2024, there will be a data gathering phase, and then there will be an analyzing and a review of potential proposals, and we expect a finalization of the review by MEPC 83 in summer 2025. This means that there will be no immediate changes to the CII framework, including any correction factors and voyage adjustments. Everything will be collected and evaluated towards 2025. And by that time, we expect that the amendments will include further CII reduction requirements from 2026 to 2030, aligned with the revised strategy ambitions, evaluation of correction factors, but it could also include additional metrics for measuring the CII, revised enforcement of the CII, and as already mentioned, application of the LCA guidelines. So moving over to other matters related to greenhouse gas and energy efficiency. There was a brief discussion on onboard carbon capture and storage. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, there were no substantial discussions. So this is now postponed to the next working group in April 2024. However, the work on the LCA guideline specifically mentions that the method for taking into account onboard carbon capture and storage should be developed. Not a high priority item, but we could still see further work through the LCA guidelines. So it does not mean that onboard carbon capture is out of the question. It's very much on the table, but it needs some time before it's matured. The other matter was an amendment to the data collection system. It's an improvement, so it needs to be adopted and will likely take effect from the reporting year of 2026. So we have further data elements making the reporting more granular, meaning fuel consumption per fuel type and energy consumer, and also requiring to report transport work for cargo vessels and passenger vessels, cruise vessels. There were also some changes to the accessibility to data to make it more accessible for future reviews. However, that was split in two, so there will be further discussions on releasing the DCS data to the public or to a wider audience. There were updates to the EDI and EEXI guidelines, minor updates, LNG tank filling rate specifications on the EDI guidelines, and also reporting on the use of shaft power limitation, engine power limitations through the EEXI. And finally, there was a discussion on the application of SHA-POLY and EPL under the EDI framework. Right now, it only applies to the EEXI, but there was also a wish to see whether this should be used for the EDI framework, in particular in light of the minimum propulsion power requirement for certain ship types. With no conclusions, so the discussions will go on, but there is a question about exactly how it should be applied, and also whether that changes the NOx technical code certification of the engines. Leaving greenhouse gas matters and related energy efficiency matters, there was quite a lot of other things being discussed at MEPC 80 related to ballast water, to biofouling, air pollution, ship recycling. So I will take you through some of the most important decisions. Starting with ballast water management and biofouling, they are combined because they all both relate to aquatic invasive species, which can be carried on the ballast water and also outside the hull, which needs to be handled as part of the biofouling topics. So there is an ongoing review of the ballast water convention and an experience building phase. I will not take you through all the different decisions related to that, but there is discussions on how to handle ballast water management compliance for ships operating challenging water quality. There are substantial concerns and divergent views on this, so there were no conclusions and work will have to continue. But not just to note here that some administrations, coastal states may actually implement their own national policies early in the IMO coming to an agreement on how to tackle this. Secondly, the IMO adopted revised guidelines on biofouling, providing recommendations on in-water inspections and also focusing on the quantitative assessment of biofouling and also observation of the anti-fouling system condition. These are not mandatory, but some coastal states already require a proof of how a ship manages the biofouling before coming to ports. So in principle, this may already be applied in some areas. And we could also foresee that at some point in time, this may become mandatory. At least there will be a discussion whether this should be made mandatory. Then quite a bunch of other issues as well. We had some amendments to MARPOL Annex 6. So this comes in addition to the data collection system already mentioned. There was a clarification on the definition of fuel oil and also defining gas fuels, or gaseous fuels. Also, the need for this was partly to separate what's required for different types of fuels. So gas fuels and low flashpoint fuels are not required to provide information on the density, sulfur content, and flashpoint. And also they are not required to provide a sampling point for the needed for the sulfur compliance. Also an amendment so that marine diesel engines replacing steam systems are now considered replacement engines under NOx regulations. IMO adopted revised guidelines on underwater radiated noise, providing overview approaches applicable to designers, shipbuilders, and ship operators to reduce the underwater noise and also assist stakeholders establishing mechanisms and programs to noise reduction efforts. Again, these are not mandatory guidelines. There were also guidelines for thermal waste treatment devices, which is an alternative to conventional incinerators regulated under MARPOL Annex 6. So these are technology neutral guidelines that can be applicable for gasification, hydrothermal and carbonization, pyrolysis of plasma, or other thermal means of disposal of waste on board a ship. Finally, related to the topic of marine plastic litter, the IMO agreed to continue developing a plan for onboard management of fishing gear. So finally, although not formally part of the MEPC, the week prior to that, we got the big news in that Bangladesh and Liberia ratified the Hong Kong Ship Recycling Convention, meaning that the threshold for ratification were exceeded and or fulfilled, and we will now have entry into force of that convention, 26th of June 2025. So I put up the two most important requirements there. On the ship side, all ships above 500 gross ton needs to carry a certified inventory of hazardous material. However, since the EU already have required this for some time, quite a lot of ships already have a compliant inventory on board, but we estimate about 23,000 vessels we need to be equipped with an IHM over the coming years. Also, ship recycling facility needs to be authorized by competent national authorities, and they can only accept that actually carry this inventory hazardous materials, and in other means comply with the convention requirements. So we expect the impact on the ship recycling facilities to be significant. I put up a link here to our newsletters where you can read more in detail about these regulations, and we also come back with more information about how this convention will be implemented in the coming years. So with that, I hand back to Simon for a poll.
Yes, hi everybody. So at this stage, we'd like to tap into your insights or your projections for what you're going to do to achieve the reduction strategies, or your thoughts about what the most likely and important solutions will be to achieve these emissions goals, and ask, what do you believe will be the most important solution to achieve total GHG emissions reduction by 20% in 2030 compared to 2008? So that's our closest goal. And if you can pick one of those, the use of carbon neutral fuels, energy efficiency improvements, operational improvements, commercial improvements, or onboard carbon capture. So which one of these will be the most significant, may have the most significant impact on achieving this 20% emissions reductions by 2030? So we'll open up the voting and give you a minute to weigh in on that. That's great. Almost half of you have voted by now. If you can just click that button, and then we can get a good result. So here are our results here. We've got over 50% thinking that the use of carbon neutral fuels is going to be the most significant, and then the efficiency improvements, either technical or operational, kind of tied for the second spot. So I throw that to our panelists. What do we make of this result?
I can go first, Simon. I guess it's in line with what we were expecting. I should mention, of course, that we focused on 2030 rather than 2050 and ultimate decarbonization, because 2030 is just around the corner. So this is really about what do we do now? And fuels is an obvious choice. I would suggest that most people answering on that one have been focusing on the biofuels, because e-fuels availability over the next handful of years is probably not going to be that great. So that's an important one. The question, of course, becomes what is going to happen with the biofuel market when the demand suddenly surges, availability, global distribution, etc. That is going to be extremely interesting to see how it plays out. Energy efficiency improvements, I note there is a balance between both of these, and that I think that's reasonable. What I find interesting is that there is a very limited focus on commercial improvements such as charter parties, because in an ideal world you would hope that charter parties would actually drive those energy efficiency improvements, whether they are technical or operational. Here the audience seems to think, and they're probably right, that there is a disconnect between these two, and I find that interesting because that tells you something about the relationship between charterers and operators. Finally, onboard carbon capture and storage, limited optimism there. I'm afraid that that's probably right, because it does look like that's going to take a couple of years. So the impact of that by 2030 is probably going to be pretty marginal. That was maybe a bit more in depth than expected, but I think I'll stop there and hand back to you.
Thanks so much. Tore, any comment from your side?
No, well, I think Eirik covered most of it. Of course, carbon neutral fuels, zero, near zero fuels, whatever you call it, is going to be important in the future, and that's clearly kind of acknowledged through this poll. And also the commercial improvements. I think there's a lot of potential, but they are highly complex they are not the low-hanging fruit. So, but over time, I think also this could have some implications.
Thanks so much. And I think we're now moving into our Q&A session. As we said before, you can click on the button on the right-hand side. Just before we go into that, we can throw up some of the many services we have around emissions reductions at DNV. Everything from signing up to our technical and regulatory newsletter. Subscribers to that will have already received an email laying out some of the insights we have on the MEPC 80 that comes out automatically, not just covering the IMO, but other significant regulatory and technical news. We have our Decarbonization Hub, of course, the webinars, which we're already part of. We have a number of pages on the website covering lots of different compliance and regulatory topics. Our publications, different services like the EEXI calculator, which of course is very important, emissions insights, the SEMP generator, emissions connect. We have a whole raft of digital services and advisory services as well that you can tap into if you're browsing through the website. So let's get to our Q&A, because there have been a very large number of questions. As I said, we'll try and cover as many of those as we can. There are a lot of different questions, gentlemen. We'll start off maybe going back to the very start. We had a target of 50% GHG reductions by 2050, and now we have 100% going from tank to wake now to well to wake, if that's correct. How much of an impact is that going to make in terms of the emissions reductions we need to make?
Well, obviously the shift from 50% to 100% is it's a doubling in a sense. But when you throw the well to wake in there, you actually are looking at even greater ambitions. I don't have the figures. Tore might have the figures sitting in his head, but it is a significant strengthening. Let me start with that. I would also ask the audience to note that this is actually a compromise solution, because we did have a number of delegations actually advocating for a 96% reduction by 2040, which would have been, and of course, even more aggressive reduction rate, and seen as quite, shall we say, challenging by the majority of the room, hence the compromise. We need to roll out all the technological tools that we have and that we'll be getting. But at the end of the day, it does come down to the fuel. You cannot get even close to even the 2040 target without having done major changes to the fuel infrastructure and the stuff we actually burn in the engines. That is an absolutely crucial one. When it comes to the figures, what that means in volumes in 2050, I think I'll pass back to Tore and ask, do you have that, Tore?
Well, 2050 is a bit of a, it's so far into the future, but if you look at 2030 and 20% emission reduction, so compared to 2008, we have already achieved a little bit about 10%, let's say 12, 13% in a well-to-wake perspective since 2008. But then looking into 2030, we could expect maybe, and that it takes into account the growth between 2008 and 2023. So in energy efficiency and carbon intensity terms, we have achieved quite a lot. We have achieved 30 to 40% reduction already, meaning that the intensity target, at least in the tank to wake perspective, as in the original strategy, is close to being fulfilled already. But towards 2030, we could expect, let's say, 10% further growth, meaning that if nothing is done, we will have nullified any achievements so far, and we will be on status quo in 2030 compared to 2008. So that means a combination of further energy efficiency improvement, which is fully expected just by fleet renewal, but we probably would need additional reductions on the existing fleet through retrofitting and also on speed reduction. And in addition, you have the 5% fuel target in energy terms, which also will, of course, give a 5% or close to 5% reduction also on the emissions. And of course, it could be 5%, could also be 7, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% as well. But 2030 is ambitious because there is no immediate levers on the regulatory side. So you cannot have this in place before the CII review and the midterm measures that we expect enter into force in 2027. So we have only a couple of years with regulatory mechanism to enforce this. So I think that will be the main challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we had quite a few questions around the enforcement mechanisms and also some around the enforceability language of the resolution itself, where mainly around the 2050 by or around 2050 indicative checkpoints. So how firm do we think then these targets are actually, or is there still some wiggle room, I guess, is the question coming in there?
I think that I think I mentioned this already, but just to repeat, a strategy is not a legally binding document. It's a policy document. It sets a direction. So in principle, it is of course up to the MEPC to take those policies and translate them into regulations, which will have binding targets that would be intended to meet those ultimate reduction goals. So it does come down to how much faith do you have in the IMO membership.
Right, exactly. Now, on this 5% target, we had several questions on this. If we could maybe expand on this, and the target reading as 5% from fuel or energy sources. What are these sources referring to? Some ask if this includes, for example, wind-assisted propulsion or other measures like that. Perhaps if we could expand on this 5% energy share by 2030.
Yes, I think we lost the sound of Eirik a little bit here, so it's apologize for that, but I think he's back online now.
Am I back?
Yes, you are back.
Okay, sorry. I suggest you to do the follow-up, Tore, because I don't know when you lost me.
No, but we had a second question now on the 5% fuel energy share and what that actually includes. So the wording is quite broad. It says near zero fuels, and that should be interpreted as in the well-to-wake perspective. Also greenhouse gas technologies, which could mean onboard carbon capture, on also energy sources, which could mean wind propulsion or assisted propulsion. So it's quite broad. Again, it's a strategy document, so it's not intended to give a precise definition what's included and not included, but it's quite broad. So at least in our interpretation, all of these elements are in. And of course, we need to look into the midterm measures to see actually how this operationalized.
Eirik?
I'm sorry, Simon. I didn't catch the original questions, but I think we'll just pass on to the next one. It was covered well by Tore.
So we've also had a lot of questions about how the CII is going to be impacted by the changes to the revised strategy, including a shift from tank to wake now to well to wake. What's the impact on the calculations? When are those figures or calculations likely to come? From our experience, obviously this is going to got to be established, but looking ahead, how do we think the CII might be impacted, and when do we think this is likely to be available to the industry?
Well, at the end of the day, go ahead, Tore.
Yeah, well, the CII has a specified a review plan in the convention already, so it's scheduled to be reviewed by the end of 2025. And so the MEPC now made a plan. So it also said it should take into account the carbon intensity targets. It's an open question whether the carbon intensity actually is tank to wake or well to wake. Normally, this strategy that all targets should, greenhouse gas targets should be interpreted as a, or considered a well to wake target. However, carbon intensity hasn't changed since the last strategy. So some say it's well to wake, others say it's as is, but the plan says that the LCA guideline should be taken into account at least. So that remains to be seen whether CII will be a enforcement mechanism or a mechanism to achieve the absolute emission targets. It will certainly be a means to achieve the 40% target, but whether it will be used for the absolute well-to-wake greenhouse gas targets remains to be seen. It's a little bit complex because time-wise you will have the review in parallel with the development of the midterm measures. They will likely actually be adopted, approved around the same time. So the question is whether the CII will continue in its same form. That's also part of the review. You could have different metrics. You could focus on carbon intensity. It could also be used for greenhouse gas matters. So a lot of this is up into the air. There will be quite a lot of work being done in this part too, and it's a bit tricky to see exactly how the CII fits into all this.
If I may also just interject quickly there, I think Tore is pointing to the right things in the sense that there is a lot of moving parts. It's challenging, and from an engineer's perspective, it's a tricky process to get this right. However, I would emphasize that this is not only technical, it's also political. And now that we have an enhanced strategic ambition, there will for sure be political pressure to also enhance the CII or strengthen the CII reduction trajectory. So that will also be part of the mix going into 25. So how this is going to play out, you know, it's watch this space. We're keeping an eye on it, but maybe we'll know more in a year or so.
So thanks, Eirik, for adding that. And one of the big things that we're seeing here in a lot of the questions is the discussion of biofuels. So this, of course, is one of the solutions that is most readily available right now in terms of, I guess, a technical solution. It's a drop-in for the most part, but there are many questions about how this will work in terms of certification of the biofuels, and also in terms of this 65% language in the regulation. Sorry, 1 second. The where is that? Yeah.
It's in the biofuel circular.
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Well,
so maybe we could have a little bit of a discussion of biofuels, how they're likely to fit in, how the regulations are going to take account of those, or how that's going to be determined, certification possibilities, this sort of thing, because there's a massive amount of interest and questions around biofuels.
Where should we start, Eirik?
At the beginning.
Yeah, well, let me start with the immediate terms, and we can come back to a little bit overall on the application of biofuels. But we see a lot of interest in the use of biofuels as both a short-term solution for CII, but also in a long-term solution. However, the IMO had not matured hadn't completed the LCA guidelines. It had no common way of dealing with the question of biofuels under the different regulations. There were also different opinions whether biofuels under the data collection system and also the CI, which is the tank to wake, should actually have a incentive to be used, or whether it should be considered as kind of the physical CO2 emissions that it actually yields. So that was why there was a big pressure to develop this circular. It's a temporary solution. I won't call it an emergency solution, but it was urgently needed. And of course, since the LCA guidelines were only completed now and doesn't provide a robust set of sustainability criteria and doesn't provide a IMO specific fuel certification system, it had to be connected to other sustainability criteria. So it was connected to this international recognized certification schemes. There is a reference to ICAO's CORSIA system, which has recognized 2 schemes. That's the ISCC and the RSB. And they also have sustainability criteria. So IMO now piggybacks on the certification schemes provided through ICAO. You could also claim that it piggybacks on the EU's Renewable Energy Directive certification schemes until the IMO can develop their own certification requirements. We do expect that the ISCC and the RSB and others will do this, kind of provide the schemes in the future, but they will conform to the LCA guidelines. However, we can already start now with existing certification schemes until the IMO develops this further. Then maybe Eirik, you would say a little bit on the use of biofuels in the total things.
Well, I was just going to mention, of course, that the work on the LCA guideline, including the certification aspects, is going to be taking place now in correspondence group that will be reporting to MEPC in 81. So there will be, it's not going to be at a standstill over the next years. Biofuels in the grand scheme of things, it's an obvious early go-to solution along with energy efficiency, but it's really about availability. And we put out a publication recently on biofuels and feedstock availability. Now that's a global availability thing. That doesn't necessarily take into account all things about local supply and availability. But I think that what we saw last year was that we had roughly 1 million tons of B30, so that's 30% blend sold globally. So that it's a million is a big number, right? It sounds big, but in the grand scheme of things, there is a long way to go and to have really significant supplies that can actually fulfill both the requirements of shipping and, not to forget, the requirements of aviation, which is also going to be a huge increasing demand for biofuels. On the plus side, we do see the suppliers itching to ramp up their production. So we have hopes that we'll be seeing a lot more, but it's not going to be a panacea. It is not the end all and be all of future shipping decarbonization, that's for sure. It's an immediate solution for now, but long term we will be seeing a much more diverse fuel palette. I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, obviously, as we look ahead, there have been a lot of questions around how does this impact the sort of the current fuel landscape that we have and the future fuels coming, whether that's blue fuels, fossil fuels with carbon capture on board, ammonia, hydrogen, methanol, LNG. Looking a tiny bit into our crystal ball, what do you think the impact will be heading to 2030 and then to 2050 on the fuel landscape?
Well, we have done several studies on exactly this and trying to find out what the potential supply is. And one of the conclusions that we have made is that there is a need for a demand signal. You will not have investments in fuel production unless there is a clear demand signal that there is a market for this fuel in shipping. This previous strategy was not deemed sufficient for that, with a 50% reduction, but now we have a much clearer strategy with a net zero target, life cycle perspective. It is also much more ambitious also in the short term. However, it does not translate into ship-specific requirements. So again, it's a question whether investors believe that this is sufficient and will start making the financial commitments that it needs to do to start ramping up production of biofuels, production of e-fuels, development of carbon capture and storage systems, blue fuels, and so on and so forth. We can also expand to energy efficiency, wind-assisted propulsion. All of this kind of now has a better investor perspective, potential from an investor's perspective, but it's still not firm regulations. So, but we expect them in a short time frame, and with that, there is a huge potential, at least to 2040, on ramping up. There's only a few years left before ramping up to 2030, but for 2040, the potential is large, provided that there is a firm demand.
I would also add just one thing to it. I mean, you nailed it there, obviously, but it's also that we have the EU creating a demand picture through the Fuel EU Maritime and the ETS, and so we may be seeing some synergistic some synergies between these sets of regional and international regulations. So I think investors in fuel production capacity should have greater surety that there is a demand that is going to ramp up quite significantly over the coming years.